Good evening. This evening we are joined by Dr. Joel Dinerstein, who is a cultural historian and professor at the Tulane University, and he is the author of The Origins of Cool in Postwar America, a seminal piece of work that defines and extrapolates the very origins of the term cool. And as we know, the term cool is simply a word, yet the actual premise is a phenomena. What is cool? Where did it come from? How has it evolved over time? And how does it interact with the economy? Welcome this evening, Joel.
Thank you, Robin. Good to be here.
So we're going to move through three phases. We're going to chat for 40 minutes this evening, and we will move through three different phases in our conversation. We're going to start with the origins of cool that you know more about than anyone else on this planet. And so delighted to start with you as our first guest on the Coolnomics live stream, to start at the very origin of something. Seems like the best place to begin. So we'll move through the origins of cool. Then our conversation will move into the evolution of cool between the 20th century and the 21st century. And then we'll move into where to next for cool and its interface with the economy, which is something, as we all know, we explore in Coolnomics specifically. So Joel, let's begin our hot nerd conversation. We both have a passion for a very particular topic. You're in New Orleans, I'm in Australia in a regional fishing village, and yet our minds and spirits have connected on this phenomenal concept of cool. So let's begin at the beginning. Always a good place to start. So you trace the concept of cool back to African-American roots, political roots. As most powerful things in the world, they generally do have a political, cultural, social depth and richness to them. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the origins of cool and your work in Lester Young, jazz musicians, existentialism. Tell us where you'd like to begin with the origins of cool.
All right, it's a big open sort of thing. All right, so you talk about it as a political thing. It's actually kind of an underground political beginning, right? So I start with that the modern usage of the word cool in several different ways starts with Black jazz musicians in the early 1940s. They don't invent the term, but they're the ones who disseminate it, because jazz was America's popular music for 30 years, 1917 to 1945. And then it's its dominant subculture in cities between the end of World War II and pretty much the beginning of about 1963. I mean, so to some extent, that's how it disseminates. And it's an entire stylistic matrix it is a resistance culture that's created by people who are excluded from culture. So it's organically a resistance culture. It's not done just to be rebellious, right? It's not done to draw attention to themselves. It's done as a way to sort of withdraw from a culture that kind of actively and individually is hurting people, right? So the way we just say just cool when we like something, I call it a term of aesthetic approval, right? When you say cool, that starts with Lester Young in particular, actually. And then Charlie Parker, more or less, uses it more. And then the whole idea that to say I'm cool meant at the time what we now mean by I'm chill, meaning I am safe in this particular place in my own style, right? That's kind of what cool meant originally. And that's changed to chill, right? And there's a certain way in which cool has this stylistic matrix of how to be in the world and on the street, right? So cool musicians wore shades. They wore shades on stage when they played at night. And I did research on this. I walked around wearing shades at night, and you can't see much. Mm-hmm. So that it's an act of both kind of defiance and style to do it, because it's not in the sense of vision or sight, it's not helping. Right. So basically through slang and style and fashion and art, the art being music, there's this whole resistance matrix around a culture that actually is actively excluding Black Americans from participating as citizens. Right. So that's where it comes from. And so you have both the word and then you have the conceptual matrix. Right. So in a sense, it's a way of rebelling in public without politically rebelling, which is why I always call it cultural rebellion, right? There's no ideology to it. nobody was trying to be communist or socialist. Although very interestingly, two of the early bebop musicians, Dizzy Gillespie definitely sort of joined the Communist Party for a year or two. And Charlie Parker had very much leftist political ideas, even though neither of them was particularly political. But in general, certainly the American government, which in the FBI, which basically chased these guys around, was not their favorite sort of people. All right, so that's where it starts. So there's a slang matrix that we become familiar with more in the 60s. Cool and hip and out of sight and beat and groovy, and all those terms come from jazz musicians in that period and get adapted later. First in the beats, then the hippies, will get to the subcultures. So, but what's interesting about this is there is an entirely separate category of artistic expression, which is film noir, that is also performing cool, but without the word. And it's mostly a white working class kind of aesthetic. The actors and the actresses are mostly white working class people. And everybody associates both those movies and those actors, Humphrey Bogart in particular, and Robert Mitchum, with cool. And although both Bogart and Mitchum loved jazz, and Mitchum actually played saxophone, and they had jazz concerts at their houses, they were not in any sense imitating Black cool. It was its own separate version of Anglo cool that came from the rebels of Anglo culture. And by Anglo, I mean originally English, and then I mean American, right? So all those outsider figures, cowboys, detectives, highwaymen, right? Gunsling, all of those folks are this entire separate cool tradition that by some accident of history shows up in a synchrony with African-American jazz culture. And so there's not a smoking gun for this. And nobody uses the word cool for film noir at the time. That comes later. But still in all, it's amazing to me that we have this. And I really do think that it is actually a convergence of African-American and Anglo working class culture, Anglo and American, that makes it possible on both sides. So that, to me, is the origins. And then we have it. And then you have sort of this kind of resistance culture that lies beneath a kind of American triumphalism after World War II, because America won the war. By the mid-50s, the United States literally is 75% of the world economy because Europe lies in ruins. And so, there's all this like, we're great and we're the greatest country in the world. And if you don't like it here, leave. And all of jazz, and particularly film noir, is like the artistic undercurrent that says, we don't really feel that way. I know you say that, but there's a lot of people who don't really feel that way. So that's where it starts. And since I don't remember what else, there were three things to your question, but where it starts is what I remember. That's what I can give you.
Yeah, where it starts is a great place to begin. And I think from reading your work, and I also intentionally didn't go too deeply into any bodies of work. I sort of skimmed across the surface to get a sense of all the bodies of work: sociology, psychology, philosophy, history, your bodies of work, etc., in developing Coolnomics, because I didn't want to be reiterating what had already been done before. And now that we're connecting and I'm going even more deeply into your work, I'm so fascinated by the fact that we arrive at such similar understandings and very specific understandings of what cool is. And to me, that speaks to this sort of universal nature to it. I think we think of cool as leather jackets or rave parties, which it certainly is in other ways. But I think you and I both share a view that it is a conceptual, sociological, cultural phenomena, even a bit spiritual, maybe Joel. And the black and the white together, the meshing of two different cultures that were opposing and in fact perhaps even violent to one another. It's a meeting point that, to me, there's a tenderness and a tension that occurs in the philosophy of cool at the very origin, at the most essential level, before we start to talk about the expressions of it, the very concept of it.
No, but I totally agree. I mean, I say in the book, I say that the reason we're obsessed with cool, both the word and the concept, because it's a myth. And what a real myth is it's something you don't know, meaning it's important, but it really does not have hasn't been analyzed to the sense that we know what it is. We just are drawn to it, so it must be important. So I think like cool is really the greatest American cultural export, right? Because it's this myth that the world now has, and we're still kind of obsessed with it, right?
Yeah.
So, right. So the fact that it's a myth makes this possible. So I'll give you an example of one more thing about the origins. As soon as the word showed up, right, in the 40s and begins to sort of, bleed out from jazz clubs, and it gets
Should we take a moment, Joel, on that? Should we take a moment on that sort of moment in your book about Lester Young and Miles Davis, about the term being used? I think that might be, maybe, if you don't mind, take a moment for the
No,
very linchpin, the moment of Lester Young
yeah,
using the
I'm
term
pretty
and the
much getting
context.
there, right?
Fine.
So Lester Young, is given credit by everyone for the dissemination of the term, as much as it starts in the mid 30s in Black culture, and we have evidence for that as a word, the etymology. And playing, and to some extent to be cool, because I've done the etymological research, means at the time in among African Americans to not be afraid. So you put up a cool front to show that you're not afraid no matter how you're feeling, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
As Ralph Ellison said, basically what we said about cool was you don't leave home without it, which is this play on this American Express campaign, right? You take your cool with you. And so, but here's why it's a myth. So Lester Young brings the term in 4 different ways. He's the one who says cool. He's the one who says I'm cool. That means I'm safe here. He doesn't mean what people now mean when they say I'm cool, which is bragging. And there is also a cool aesthetic, both in terms of a form of jazz that is kind of muted and low key and melodic, but there's also an aesthetic in which you are cool in public, right? You're a person who has a certain amount of charisma, but is really low key, and people are either afraid of you, or you're kind of mysterious, or they don't know what to make of you. And for me, like the ultimate compliment of someone who's cool is a cool person is someone who takes the heat out of a situation, right? If you're really cool, you're capable of that, right? So, but here's why it's a myth. When the word cool shows up out of jazz culture, and then the beat generation writers, Jack Kerouac, et cetera, start writing about it. Jack Kerouac, 1950, writes a letter saying, I'm beginning to have a theory of cool. And so that's like 5 years after it comes out of jazz clubs, right?
Yeah.
But there's this phrase, playing it cool. So Americans immediately become obsessed with the word, like they really like it. So it spreads quickly. And then this phrase, playing it cool, is the thing everybody, even sociologists, sort of grab onto. Like, so, and it's very much a male thing. You have to play it cool. We still, of course, have the expression, right? And we sometimes use it in terms of romantic relationships, right? And sometimes use it in terms of job situations, right? Don't be eager, don't be a tryhard. All of that is cool. But sociologists write these articles about what playing it cool means. And they talk about it in like playing poker, and they talk about it in kind of all these male-dominated kinds of places, right? But the point I'm making about cool being a myth is that it's immediately seized upon by the entire society. And that does not happen often to a word that is also a concept. Like, the word of the year can be the word of the year, but if the word of the year brings in a concept and we're still using it almost a century later, something else is going on. So that's why we're here, you and I, because we want to know what was going on, and we found out in different ways. And then Miles Davis becomes, in a sense, the celebrity of cool, right? Lester Young invents it, and although everyone in jazz knows him and he's like a giant, outside of that, people don't know him all that much. And except what they should know is that he plays the best saxophone solos on the early Billie Holiday records, because he and Billie Holiday were musical soulmates. But Lester Young basically bequeaths his entire cool matrix to Charlie Parker, who is the genius and a heroin addict, and Miles Davis, who carries it for the next 50 years. And so Miles Davis, the 2 people who are most often mentioned if you want a historical figure of cool, are Miles Davis and James Dean. They're in the same period. They're doing very different things. And Miles Davis is already more of an adult than James Dean is, as a sort of troubled young angsty, stylish man. But they're the people everybody chooses, and it's all from like this mid-50s, late 50s period. But Miles Davis knows, and that he gets both his musical aesthetic and his stylistic aesthetic from Lester Young, and then he takes it in a different way. Lester Young is more low key, and Miles has this kind of quiet, fierce cool that scares people, and he wanted it to scare people. One time somebody went up, this is a great Miles Davis story. One time he was on the street in the late 50s and talking to people in Miles Davis mode, like his low, raspy voice and, very few words. And some guy like from his hometown saw him and said, started going, Miles, it's great to see you, blah, blah, blah. And Miles like just cut him, just did not say anything to him and sort of made a gesture to say, I'll talk to you later. And he said, never approach me like that in public, never. So it's not that it's an act. It is sort of a persona and a pose for a specific set of reasons. And he doesn't want to break that there. So when I tell my students that, African Americans, the period, they weren't cool in front of each other when they were hanging out. They had all the emotional range you would have, but in public or in front of white people, that's the conceptual matrix. That's the resistance.
Yeah, and would you say that safety, an element of safety, lives at the heart of the origins of cool? That it was survival on an existential level, to hold restraint, to not be vulnerable, to not be seen too much, to not be seen as being emotionally expressive, therefore being vulnerable by the police or by white people. It had a survival. There was a survival element to
survival at an
the reasoning. Yeah.
No, it is exactly survival at an existential level. That is exactly right. Also, that's its crossover to film noir. And in film noir, most protagonists are trying to survive at an existential level in which either they've committed a crime or they're in danger or something like that. There's a great book on film noir, and the title is Under the Threat of Death. And that's his description of the noir aesthetic. So for African Americans, that's not art and that's not funny, right? I mean, that's their lives, particularly Black men. And so to that extent, it is survival and existential. And then this is kind of a Nietzschean sort of way of thinking about it, but then it's about how do you make style out of your existential survival needs? And that's what they do. Right.
Yes.
So
yes, and I think that's a lens through which for us to see the spectrum of cool from its most survivalist, deep, political, serious origins right through to this thing that can also be, but it depends on your literacy level in terms of culture and society. It can also be this thing that's frivolous and desirable and buyable. What a range to have within the one concept. This one phenomena can span the range of a deep political origin right through to something that people think they can just manufacture or buy, but as we know, you can't. It is it's a dedication and a commitment and an awareness. It's excellence, it's originality, it's relevance, it's all of the sort of things we talk about. The one thing that I'm playing with at the moment, Joel, is whether cool must always have restraint or not. I bring restraint into the credibility pillar for myself, but that's one thing I'm specifically in our bodies of work, I'm really looking at the moment. Must cool always have restraint? So, I think it must have choice. I don't know if it's restraint. Yeah.
So this is a slight digression, right?
Yeah.
So although I've never really called it this, I do sometimes when I'm teaching it, right? There's really what I call classic cool and what I call generational cool, right? Sure. But classic cool in particular goes back to the origins. It is low key, restraint, stylish stoicism, sort of aesthetic excellence, but always within a certain structure of restraint, right? But this changes almost immediately. So in the late 50s, when we get James Dean and Elvis and Marlon Brando, their aesthetics are performatively emotional and exciting, right? They're about breaking sort of the frame of restraint. That's what, in fact, that generation of Montgomery Clifton, Brando, and James Dean do, and that's what Elvis does. But that's because that's what those teenagers needed. So that's kind of the first
Cool.
generational cool after cool shows up. So, you know, when black jazz musicians invent cool, it is pretty much an artistic generational style.
Yep.
It's like people don't seem to think about them as a young generation of artists, but that's what they are. They're no different from the Impressionists or, you know, the Modernists or anybody else, right? They are bebop musicians, and Lester's the transitional figure, and they are young rebel artists. But the first generation after them are the teenagers, and they're younger, and they're living in a different kind of very scary Cold War reality, and they want to burst out of it. And they get Elvis and James Dean and Montgomery Clift and the Beat Generation writers, who are all about trying to re-enchant the world by showing that it's beautiful and we need to embrace it, and, you know, we need to sort of be joyous and all that. And that is the opposite of the restraint thing. But the restraint thing is always in cool. It's the classic cool. And every generation still has classic cool figures. And there's still like George Clooney and Denzel Washington and even like Ryan Gosling. And there's still like Julianne Moore, and even Michelle Obama to some extent has some of that. That is always in the game. That classic cool. That's why it's classic.
Yeah.
But generational needs are very different.
Sure.
And, you know, there's no way that Humphrey Bogart and Robert Mitchum would be cool actors today as young men. That's like they just would be thought of as cold, hard dudes.
Yeah.
Like they'd be gangsters, but, you know, and have that. But it's not like they would be, you know, the people of the moment.
Yeah. Well, they couldn't even exist. Hey, like that would be, they'd be ghosts because the zeitgeist shifts and the definition of cool moves in line with the spirit of the time. And yeah, interesting how that works.
So
Should we unpack?
cool is the zeitgeist. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. What was that?
I was just going to say generational cool means the zeitgeist. What is zeitgeist?
Always evolving. What's the spirit now? And now, oh, next minute, now. Yeah, where are we? Shall we talk a little bit more while we're in our origin phase for a moment? Talk a little bit more about some of the other figures of cool from these sort of origin times and who was mattering, what made them culturally magnetic.
So what's interesting about this period, I mean, you know, there's lots of things interesting about this period, but it's mostly cool as a masculine aesthetic when it shows up for kind of obvious reasons, right? If you're going to be somebody who's kind of mysterious and calmly defiant and stylishly stoic, you know, even stoicism is not really available to women in public culture before second wave feminism, and even, you know, when second wave feminism showed up. So what's fascinating about this is a couple of the women who qualify, I mean, and if you read the rhetoric of how they're written about, it's all there, except nobody would call them cool. The actress Lauren Bacall, the moment she shows up, right, and then throughout her whole movie career, particularly early, Simone de Beauvoir, who nobody talks about as cool because, and I don't get it, like she's cool in every way, both in the restraint way, in the excellence way as a philosopher and a writer. She lived life on her own terms in a way that
rebel autonomy. Yeah, she's a bad bitch. Yes.
She writes the book that says, you know, that women are other than men, and basically starts second wave feminism. She has lovers all over the world that are all A-list writers.
Yeah.
Right. Unapologetically. Right. So she fits completely, but no. So you have these women who are there, but they can't really be movie stars. Lauren Bacall being the exception. And then Barbara Stanwyck, who I think is really, you know, fantastic in that period, and has not really survived in public memory beyond like cinephiles, people who love old movies. So it's a male aesthetic and remains so. And that only changed in the 21st century, really. And so there are those figures, right? The major figures I have brought up, right, of the, you know, the black jazz musicians, then Elvis and James Dean and Miles Davis and Jack Kerouac, and Paul Newman and, you know, people like that. And so, you know, we can, you know, that does a lot of work for us, that they're the main figures in that period. everything shifts in the 60s. That's why sort of, the 60s are like a whole cultural field, like the 50s are, right? It's not true of every decade, but it's true of those two.
Mm.
And so the 60s changes for a lot of reasons. It changes because we have new subcultures. We have the beats, then the hippies, and both matter. It changes because all of music changes, and jazz completely gives way first to rock and roll in the 50s, and then to British invasion and more rock and roll. And then you get Bob Dylan, and you get an actual lyrical resistance culture that is more both ideological and political.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I by the way, I flirted with calling my book When Cool Was Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And because until 1963, the word is not common, no one's really using it. So you truly had to be cool as a person to be thinking about it and be interested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once it breaks through and becomes something that people talk about and we have iconic figures, it sort of changes. Now, I'm very glad I didn't call it that, but I'm it's just a way of saying that then when it breaks out, and by like the late 60s, everyone is thinking about being cool. Like it's a conscious thought for teenagers and advertising agencies and everybody else.
Yeah. So it moved from the avant-garde into the mainstream along the innovation timeline, we might say, from the innovation to the early adopters, and then the people who thinking that they can just leverage a skimmed version of it, which, as we know, doesn't work. That's the rule of cool.
It's true, but the 60s are really like, it's still kind of early adopters, like till about 68.
Sure, right? Yep.
Right. But they're not the innovators, right? I mean, Bob Dylan actually says, I went to see Miles Davis at a club and he was so cool, it made me sick. Like, so there are models now. And so, it's time for different kinds of innovators. And now we have the concept afoot in the culture, and it's going to do its own thing.
Do you think, one question off the page before we keep moving, do you think cool existed as a concept before Lester Young, before this sort of surge, this breaking through from the underground as in not even defined, into some sort of definition, even in the avant-garde? Do you think cool has always existed as a phenomena of a sticky point, a shorthand for resonance, but in the 50s was when it started to become articulated? Or do you think it really was a whole new sociological phenomena that didn't exist before? I have my own opinion on this, but what do you think?
Oh,
Joel?
good. I want to hear your opinion too. I think it was actually an entirely new sociological phenomenon.
You
and
do?
I'll tell you.
Okay, great.
And when people tend to do what I call the pre-birth of the cool, they tend to talk about things like the it girl, because, we still have the term, but Hollywood coins this term in the 20s. And what they mean is there's a new figure, right? There's a new stylistic avatar, right? And she is this girl, and she has the right combination of sort of energy and looks and style for this moment. She is the zeitgeist girl. So they're not entirely wrong, but cool is not really what that is. And there have certainly been people who were cool before we had the word. But I mean, either they were outlaws, which is a fine word for it, right? They were outlaws, they were artistic rebels, things like that.
Yeah.
It's like cool to some extent. The synonym is rebellion. And, if you were a young artistic rebel of some kind, chances are you were a cool figure, whether that means, I don't know, Lord Byron, right?
Or Einstein. Yeah, that sort of,
Einstein's tough
rebellion,
because,
autonomy, excellence. Yeah, they're interesting questions to ask.
But what we have, why it's a new phenomenon, is first of all, it's coming from a totally excluded outside race from the white West. And this is really important and new and kind of world shattering. It doesn't really have precedent, right? Believe me, nobody in American society wants our youth culture to come from African Americans at that time, or probably ever, right? You may not know this, but this is going to know this. This is absurd, but true. In the early 1980s, when MTV was getting started, they didn't want to show any of Michael Jackson's videos. And because they said that white suburban kids don't want to see black, videos by black men, right? And of course, then, Michael Jackson's videos, all of them from that record, become the biggest videos, I don't know of all time, but I think of all time, right? So that's how bad, and not only how badly they misread the situation, and of course, his own personal kind of genius in pop and music and dance and all of that, but like that's how much the American society would not want the resistance culture to be built by a race they consider as an outsider race, right? So we have that. Then we have modernity and consumer culture, and we have had, and it's not like modernity is new, but the way in which consumer culture works and advertising works and television works, which shows up in 1947, is really quite new. And so we have, the word teenager is coined in 1935. TV starts in 1947. The whole idea of young people having enough disposable income and not working to help their parents is fairly new in the 1920s. So this doesn't really have precedent, right? There were definitely cool people that have those qualities of autonomy and excellence, innovation, and going their own way and not giving a fuck what anybody thinks. Those people existed, but we really didn't have the phenomenon.
Sure.
And so it is totally a mid-20th century phenomenon. And to go back, I really do think it's a convergence of specifically African-American and Anglo-American, meaning the American culture that comes from England, together in the United States. That's why when I curated the exhibit, we called it American Cool, because I wanted to draw attention that it happens here. It does not mean there's no cool everywhere else. It means that the actual emergence of the conceptual matrix happens because all those people are here and interacting with each other. And, so I don't think it exists before. I don't.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, fair enough. Something that I'm seeing is perhaps a hypothesis is it seems to me that cool, in the same way that Simone de Beauvoir or women could never be defined as cool publicly, and same with African American people, not the origins not wanting to be attributed to that particular culture. It seems to me that cool is, and as we know, nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is interconnected. So if we are living in a Western society that is capitalist, colonial, and patriarchal in its most structural form, of course, that is going to show up in the signifiers of what is cool. And it's like the ultimate stamp that used to be held by the gatekeepers, maybe held by white people and men as the ultimate final note of safety, final note of acceptance and belonging in a society, that if a woman can never be cool, she will never be fully recognized in the public history of our world. It's incredibly powerful. And just to mention that exhibition that you mentioned a moment ago was your exhibition at the Smithsonian, wasn't it? On a retrospective on cool as the concept. So
yeah, and when I was doing that in 2014, American Cool, like I was aware, I said, am I doing this because it's over? Like I really was worried that I was historicizing a concept that may have run its course. I mean, even though I knew it would continue, but only in a sort of diluted, kind of modified version. And I'm more confident now than I was 10 years ago that I think it will actually survive and continue to evolve in some way. And I think it's completely in the hands of women at the moment. And I've been that for a while, but we'll get to that later.